Manipulators rarely advise you to seek new and diverse information or to learn and research for yourself. It tends to be safer for exploitative and irresponsible leaders to keep their citizens in the dark. In their view, less independent thought is better. Independent thought leads to an inquiring mind, a mindset that eventually leads to the questioning of authority figures, and that is the one thing that inadequate leaders do not want. When a leader discourages questioning of his or her leadership style, actions and motivations, that is a sign that they have something to hide, that they may not be worthy of the public's trust. A responsive leader welcomes and encourages questions from the citizens that have entrusted them with their safety, economic stability, and their confidence that a certain level of civility in society will be constant. Responsive leaders would be appalled, disappointed, and disgusted if the public did not question such factors. And that quote comes from Teresa Stover. Welcome to Surviving the Matrix, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Maxwell Egan. It's a pleasure to be with you once again, and I will be your host for the next hour. Well, folks, it's good to see that we actually have some good news this week in the form of the controversial Food Safety Modernisation Act, Bill S-510, which now appears to be dead in the water. And folks, for a minute there, I thought that this was going to be one of the final nails in the coffin when I heard that the bill had been passed by the Senate with a vote of 73 to 25. But it turns out that now the bill has been sent on to the House of Representatives for approval. It would appear that the House of Representatives has singled out Section 107 of the bill because it contains a revenue-raising provision, and such a provision has been deemed by the House of Representatives as being unconstitutional, as in the American legal system, all bills for raising revenue must originate from the House of Representatives. So it would appear that because the Senate has violated the funding origination clause, the House has implemented a procedure known as blue slipping, and this will effectively block the bill, keeping it out of consideration and sending it back to the Senate. And the only possible quick fix that exists for this would come in the form of a unanimous consent agreement in the Senate to strike out that revenue-raising provision. But there is one senator, Senator Tom Coburn, who has already stated that he will oppose the bill, so unanimity will be impossible. So this means that the bill may effectively be squashed, but of course it will be reintroduced next year. But it will take a very different form from the current one. So that really is good news, and that really is a victory for freedom, a victory for what is good and right and wholesome in the world. Very refreshing, folks. Very refreshing to see that it has been squashed, though it is, of course, very disturbing that it managed to pass the Senate with a vote of 73 to 25, as this would appear to indicate that there are 73 people in the Senate who really don't care about the people of their country. But that's another matter. The good part is that it's been squashed for now. It is, of course, kind of fascinating that it was a tax provision that was deemed unconstitutional, and that's what squashed the bill, when the whole bill is unconstitutional. In fact, from what I can gather, almost everything the American government has done in recent times is unconstitutional. The act itself is unconstitutional. The searches at airports by the TSA are unconstitutional. The police stopping people at roadblocks and having road checks is unconstitutional. The fact that the government claims it now owns all water is unconstitutional. Everything the American government does is unconstitutional, so it's kind of ironic that they would not see removing the people's rights to grow food as being unconstitutional, but the fact that the bill contained a tax provision. It's kind of splitting hairs a little bit, folks, but I probably shouldn't get started on that topic, or I may just sit here and rant about it for hours. It does make me wonder, however, how much the American people are prepared to take. It really does. I mean, what we are seeing with even the attempted introduction of a bill such as S-510 is truly a loss of America. Everything that makes America America seems to be being removed from the people. The government has long since ceased to act in the best interest of the people. I mean, many of the people in positions of power within America are blatant sociopaths. I mean, just look at the most recent head of Homeland Security, Janet Napolitano, who appears to be very much cast from the same mould as her psychotic predecessor, Michael Chertoff, inasmuch as she is also one of the most blatant domestic enemies that the people of the United States have ever faced, one of the biggest enemies of the Constitution the country has ever faced. And these sort of people very much need to be removed from office. But I mean, Homeland Security should be disbanded anyway. The similarities between America's Department of Homeland Security and Adolf Hitler's Department of Fatherland Security are, of course, way too obvious to be casually dismissed by anybody with a functioning brain. Now, on last week's show, when I was talking about the fact that there is no real money in circulation, and the current global debt that is owed to the IMF and World Bank is actually fictional debt, it doesn't really exist. In response to that show, I had a few emails from people and a few conversations with people who were asking me to explain how money is created, where money comes from. And I'd like to touch on that a little bit today, actually. And to do so, I can really think of no better way of explaining it than to read a short passage to you from a book that was written by a friend of mine called Thomas Anderson. The book is called Classified, the book Governments and Banks Don't Want You to See. And I'll just read you a short passage from that, which does a very good job of explaining exactly what happens when you go and take out a loan. And what Thomas says in the book here is, since there is no lawful money, gold or silver in circulation backed by anything of value, the governments and the banks, as well as you and I, are essentially bankrupt. The little pieces of paper circulating in place of money, affectionately called currency, are in reality debt notes and worthless. What usually happens in a loan situation is that the borrower is established, being the all capitals legal fiction person, the straw man, and then the principal creditor for the straw man, namely you, enters into a loan contract with the bank, with the assumption being that the bank is going to give you some of its money, for which service you agree to pay them back over a period of time, plus interest. However, what really happens is that the bank monetizes your instrument, the contract with your signature, and turns it into a credit in its books, essentially a bookkeeping entry as a liability. A liability means it owes you something, and it uses this newly created credit on its account, which is no more than ones and zeros on a computer, to then create a check or deposit those fictional digits into your account. So, if you created the money, then why do you have to pay back a loan if they never loaned you anything? Exactly. And I couldn't have said it better than that, folks, and that very much sums up exactly what happens when you go to the bank to take out a loan. So you see, you didn't actually enter into a contract with the bank. What you did was you created a promissory note with your signature on it. For a start, in order for it to even be a valid contract, it would need to bear two signatures, being your signature and the signature of the bank. But it doesn't bear two signatures, it only bears your signature. So you have essentially gone into the bank and you've created a promissory note. You've created paper money to the value of whatever you signed the promissory note to be. It might be $50,000 or $100,000 or whatever. And then the bank takes that promissory note from you and they change it into their paper, so that you now have their paper, the debt notes that we pass around in our society. And because you are using their paper, they trick you into giving it all back to them. But really it's your money. They didn't create it, you did. And this works virtually the same for governments, folks, only instead of the governments creating a promissory note in the form of a so-called contract, what they do is they use their own paper. They get pieces of paper and they put fancy little decorations on them, and they call them government bonds. And then they take them over to the bank and they exchange it for the bank's paper, and the bank again charges them interest for using the bank's paper. I mean, for all intents and purposes, we could be passing government bonds around to each other. But we don't. We use the paper that is issued by the banksters, and that costs money. A lot of money. See, this was the significance, as I mentioned last week, of Christ overturning the tables of the money changers. And notice the term used in that confrontation is money changers. It's not bankers, it's money changers. You see, Christ wasn't worried about things like fractional reserve banking. He was concerned that the money changers were changing money into their paper and forcing people to use their paper, which effectively launders all of that money back into the possession of the bankers, plus interest, because they attach interest to their paper. And the only thing that's ever produced, of course, is the principal. The interest never exists. It's never put into circulation. So it's therefore impossible to pay back. This is what keeps society always at each other's throats, always looking for ways to profit from each other in order to find that money to pay off that interest. But even so, the interest can never be repaid because money is created as debt and only the principal is ever created. So essentially, if everybody tried to pay off every dollar that they owe on every bill that they owe, there would be absolutely no money in circulation and the country would still be in debt because, as I said, the interest never exists. But essentially what I'm attempting to say here is that the people create the money themselves when they take out a loan. There is no loan from the bank. There never was any loan from the bank. They are simply changing your paper into their paper and then laundering all of the money that you created back into their possession. And there lies the inherent evil of the money changers. And as I said last week, folks, this system of laundering people's promissory notes into their own possession and attaching interest to the very money itself is one of the most corrupt, one of the cruelest, and one of the most evil crimes that has ever been perpetrated upon the human race. It is this manipulation of the economic system that has kept people in a constant state of hardship, has caused people to work their entire lives simply in a vain attempt to keep their head above an endless ocean of self-generating debt, only to find that at the end of their lives they have virtually nothing to show for it, has been responsible for starting countless wars, has reduced countries to the state of the third world, and has been responsible for the death of quite literally millions upon millions of innocent people. And if that were not bad enough, one of the most disturbing parts about the entire situation is that these facts are well known and that this system of financial slavery is promoted by our governments simply by their failure to ever address the issue. And it's also a very clear indication of who these governments actually work for. And folks, it's certainly not the people. The monetary system is truly one of the most misunderstood and most taken for granted institutions in our entire society. Money is something that we all use every day, and yet very few people ever really take the time to think about where this stuff actually comes from and what gives it value. In fact, it really is surprising how taken for granted money is. I suppose it's simply because of the familiarity of the stuff. It's just there, and we just accept that it exists and that it has value. But as I said, the question is, where does it come from? How does it come into being? And how come there is so much of it in circulation? There never used to be that much money in circulation, so where did it all come from? That's the question. And as I've just explained to you, where it comes from is that people create it when they take out loans. I mean, can you really stop and grasp it and see how insidious this money changer scam is? People create money themselves when they go to the bank and fill out promissory notes, but the bank forces them to use the bank's paper and charges them money for using their paper. Then people take this paper, they go out and they buy all sorts of possessions and houses and land and all this stuff, and then they have to pay for it 4 or 5 times over because they're using the bank's paper. And as more and more people take out loans and buy more things and create more money, they put more paper in circulation, so everybody's paper is suddenly worth far less than it was. And all of this paper that's been issued by the bank into circulation all has interest attached to it. But there was only ever the principal that was created. The interest was never created, so the interest doesn't exist. There's this huge interest debt floating around society that can never be paid. So by design, the system eventually implodes, because there isn't enough money in circulation to ever pay off the bills, and so it starts at the bottom, but eventually right up the food chain, everybody defaults on their loans, and all the wealth gets transferred into the hands of the money changers. This is how it works. It's a scam to control all global wealth through the control of money.